In Sandra Cisneros' latest book, Martita, I Remember You, Martita, Te Recuerdo, Corina, once known to her friends as Pufina, is living her life in Chicago when she finds a letter she'd long forgotten. This and other ephemera of bygone days when she was young, single, and following her dreams to become a writer in Paris lead Corina to respond to her friend Martita through this epistolary work. In it, we learn of the ways in which Corina struggled to find a place to live and to survive inhospitable spaces she once dreamed would be welcoming and grand in the City of Light. While she struggled, moving from one flat to another, counting her pennies, and staving off dangerous situations, it is Martita who remains a constant in her life, someone who speaks the same language and who understands the unspoken code that women find in the most powerful and unforgettable connections they forge, perhaps ever, in their lives. This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. I spoke to author Sandra Cisneros from her home in San Miguel de Allende about her new book, Martita, I Remember You, Martita, Te Recuerdo. Can you tell us the story about how this book came to be?
Yes, I can tell you the story. The story is that back in the late 80s, early 90s, probably more like the early 90s, when Random House picked up my books and reissued them and nationally, I had the option of writing a book of short stories. And this was one in a collection that was to be called eventually Woman Hollering Creek. And I handed it in, but my editor and my agent both agreed the story wasn't done. And I could see that. The story was simply the first part of this book. But it was a story I was very fond of. And I put it away. It's based on my own travels, but not when I was 20. And I was practically 30, thanks to an NEA grant. It came about after I finished a house on Mungo Street in Greece, and I had a Eurail pass, and I was traveling around. But at that time, there weren't ATM machines, and so my money was locked into an account that I had stashed away my funds in Greece. Not a lot, but just enough so I could travel. And then there was no way to get my money, and I didn't know about wiring. I was very naive about how to transfer money from one country to another. So I was unlimited funds. And everywhere I went, whether it was in Italy or former Yugoslavia, different places that I would meet women, they always took me in. And there were many of them, that I would meet in Spain or France or wherever I went. And they were very kind to me and generous. And the women who took me in, unlike the men who took me in, because there were men who took me in also, didn't require anything in return for their kindness. And so I wanted to write about all those women and put them all together with my experiences in Paris, which was a great disappointment to me because I expected Paris to be, in my mind, like the photographs of Auger, a photographer who documented disappearing Paris at the end of the previous, in the Belle Époque, in that era. And I had this visual of what Paris was going to be like. And imagine my shock when I would see these fast food restaurants on these old avenues. And so it was a shock. And also, I didn't have a lot of money. I look Arab. So I was treated very badly, except by the people who didn't have anything, the people who work on the metro or the women who come from other countries who spoke languages I could speak. And they were so memorable to me that later a real letter came from a real Martita. And it sparked this story because by then years had passed and I couldn't define what that experience meant to me until I wrote this story. So I guess the story is a letter never written to all the women, but especially the real Martita, because it's, that she sparked a letter that brought back these emotions that I didn't have words for. and these experiences and these dangerous predicaments that young women get themselves into. And sometimes we don't tell anyone about them because we don't want to seem like we're fools, and we don't want to advertise our failures. So this was about, bringing that to the fore. And of course, it lay dormant since the early 90s. It was something I treasured, and a story that meant a lot to me. But I got swept up into having to deliver a novel, and then things happened in my life, like my mother's death. I had to write about that. I wanted to write a book of essays. And finally, I had time to get back to it about 4 or 5 years ago. And now that I'm older, I could write the middle and last sections of my story. And I really, there's so many women that are Martita in my life. Some of them are related to me. Some of them are friends. Some of them are people I met in my voyages. Some of them I've never heard from again. And some are very, very close to me even now. So that's the story behind the story.
Oh, thanks for sharing all that. Martita is Marta Quiroga Pasco. I love that she has this great name, such a real name. And she's a character that is so fully composed that I think of her, as I remember someone from my own long past too, someone who was important to me during those uncertain formative years, short 20s heading into 30s. Those were still uncertain, sort of unformed times, very unsettled.
Especially for
times.
women,
Yeah.
because you've just spent the past decade from your 20s to the 30s trying to please others. And I think that's the most difficult decade because, adolescence is not exactly a bouquet of roses either, but the 20s or 30s is like, you've got these dreams and you've got things your family wants and your boyfriend or your husband or your brothers or the church or the state all will things on you that you haven't even ever lived a moment in your life where there wasn't someone telling you what a good woman is. You don't even know yourself. So you're trying to define that, in that terrible decade of the 20s. I always joke and tell young women, this is going to be the hardest decade when you go into your 20s, but don't worry, it only lasts 10 years.
That's so true. I feel like, books come to us when they must, or when we're ready for them. Maybe you're the one who said that. Maybe I'm quoting you.
That's right. Because books are medicine, and they have to come, and be the right prescription. Sometimes books come too late in our lives or too early.
I think this one comes with impeccable timing for me for many, many reasons. But I was thinking a little while ago about, well, what if I had come across this story as part of Woman Hollering Creek, say, how would I have received this very story? And maybe it's unfair to, make those deliberations or try to guess or try to just to even imagine it. They come when they must come. And I think too about the ways that Corina sort of is here and present now in my life. With impeccable timing too. I wonder if you can talk about Corina Bufina.
Yeah, Corina didn't have a name in the beginning, and she was just the autobiographical I character. And eventually, she started just developing her own background and her, even though, she borrowed a lot from mine, but she started saying things that were not autobiographical. And I was really startled, when she took off in that direction, because there's so much of the Chicago part of me. But then, as she developed as a character, she became a composite of other women from Chicago that I know. And, I didn't have a name for her, as I said in the beginning, except for Bufina. And I had to find a name that was close enough to Bufina that the girls could play. And I thought of a woman whose husband had been a mayor of a large city, and who had been helped her husband in his political career, and then he just kind of dumped her for like a model, younger model, and her name was Corina. And people who follow politics will know who I mean. But I admired her. I admire her still. And her name stayed with me as someone who was strong and survived that public humiliation, and as someone who with a lot of integrity and beauty. And I just liked her name, so I borrowed it. So Corina, in homage to you, thank you.
Oh, the thing about Corina is that she's trying so mightily to make this path for herself toward her goals. And it's one that others have taken, and many still take these paths toward these goals that they think they must traverse these paths in Paris or in similar places. Corina would like to be a great artist, and start where many other great artists have. But it's not a spoiler, I don't think, to say that, well, let's just say the road is paved with with many issues and with many obstacles for her. It's long, it's cold, it's inhospitable for the most part, except as she recalls her time with Martita. I think it's easy to think that nostalgia is coloring her perspective a little bit, or that the past is so easy to glorify because of how loaded down with expectation it had been. But I think that to think of this only as this kind of, epistolary retelling that's all imbued with nostalgia is wrong. It just diminishes the importance of the story of a friendship. I mean, for me, it's almost a Bildungsroman of sorts still. And even if they have not connected in a very long time, there's something so substantive in that absence.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was searching for, because when I write, I have a question that I'm walking towards the answer, but I don't know the question until I get to the answer. That's always the process for me. It's a very opaque and nebulous path that I'm just intuitively walking towards the answer to a question I don't even know, and unless I know even less the answer. So for me, it was to try to define, why do people enter our lives so briefly sometimes, and yet the emotions we feel for them are so profound and last an eternity. And I was trying to walk through that and answer that question. Who were these women that I met so briefly? Some have, only one has stayed within my life, and the rest have, disappeared. Who were they, and why are they important to me now as I'm 66? I'm turning 67 this year. Why do I remember them so clearly and so profoundly? And I guess the key is, why do I have so much love and gratitude for them even now? So that's what drove me to it. We can love someone even if they're in our lives, for a very brief time, and get to know them deeply and share our vulnerabilities, and it can be mutual. So I think that's what I was searching for. I believe maybe you or another reader will tell me different, because I just wrote the story from an intuitive place, and it's like dreaming a dream, and you're going to tell me what it meant.
I think in our friendship groups where there's a Martita, there's also always a Paola. I thought that was so just, for me anyway, so resonant. And I know this was true for me in my early 20s. So there's this third person who's always kind of there, sometimes not there, but mostly there, who's also a friend, gets to be in the group, but not the most sympathetic or reliable one in the group. But she's important for other reasons too, because, she's sort of like a flat character for our lives. And a flat character is necessary for our story to stand up. So,
well, also to inspire us that there's a road I didn't take,
yeah.
And she's successful, and what did she do that she was able to garner that success? Those are, they're not always the most honorable people, but they're the most interesting.
She is very interesting. I love this character for many reasons, not just because she reminds me of people that I know, but she's just so real. She helps us appreciate the Martitas all the more, I think, also.
Yes. Yes.
Um, I would not conflate Esperanza from House on Mango Street and Corina in this book, but Corina's story shows that she did leave Chicago, did live abroad. And that's a lot for Corina. That's a lot for any one of us, but that's a lot for Corina. I
That's
don't,
a lot for someone coming from a house where, you don't have any relative that ever did that. That's a real kind of gringa thing to do. And your
yeah,
family doesn't understand, like, why would you want to go somewhere without your family? Right? That's very
yes,
shocking for our culture. And, whereas other cultures, like the white culture, would want to send their daughter to travel, and see the world. But for us, who are sometimes, we feel we must make that grand tour so that we can become independent women and we can travel fearlessly through the world and we can become artists or physicians or whatever we want to become. That's like a rite of passage, but it's not for our culture. And maybe for upper class or upper middle class women, but not from the household I came from.
yeah. I totally agree. I just think that it was a huge thing for her. And I don't think of her attempts as failed attempts. I don't consider her anything like a failure. I think of her as complex, intelligent. There, even in her small family, going to her job and worrying about her house and, stripping the varnish off the furniture. I mean, I just find her to be so compelling for all of those reasons. The things that she set about to do that were so grand, and the things that she must return to just as a matter of, this is the course of her life. I've been reading about the life of Robert Walser. So here's a guy who, everybody says he wrote small. I mean, he literally wrote microscripts. These, he wrote tiny stories across small slips of paper, but there could be like 600 words, scrawled on a business card or something. But he was someone who prized small stories. He was, as his biographer says, the clairvoyant of the small. He worked at a bank. He worked in an elastics factory, and he put himself through a school for butlers. He could not manage a job while writing, but then he would put those jobs to use later by writing about them. And he was a champion of ordinary lives. He was also someone who walked a lot. And talk about conflating. I couldn't help but think about this book as I was reading the new biography of Walser and thinking about Martita at the same time, and how somebody like Robert Walser would have been so taken with Corina's story. And I just feel like Corina, I don't consider her anything like someone who didn't achieve her goals. I consider her somebody who authors would want to write about. Authors like you and authors like Walser. Those stories are so important for the smallness. And small doesn't mean trivial or unimportant. Small means making the seemingly ordinary extraordinary, as you know.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the stories of Lucia Berlin
Yeah.
also, that writes about cleaning women and, women who are at the laundromat. And certainly, when I began this story began from my own story, but it didn't go there because it started changing. And I realized I was writing about my relatives who also had big dreams, and my students and young mentees who wanted to be writers, and all these other women that became something else other than what they had aspired to, but by no means had an uneventful or unsuccessful life. It just that it veered into a different path than the one that they could see when they were younger. And I also, I thought about some of my young mentees who, sometimes took jobs working as saleswomen at a women's department store, but they could talk to you about great works of literature. Sometimes we typecast people by their job and don't realize the richness of their interior lives. So I think that that's, without being aware of it, that's where I went with this story.
Something about Martita, I Remember You is the dearth of photos of the three friends together. But that's so real. This was at a time when we couldn't just pull out our phones and take so many pictures, dozens and dozens of pictures of ourselves. I remember I had one or two, maybe they were Polaroid photos of my Martita, of my friend who reminds me so much of this character, and who remains one of the most important people in my life, even if we don't talk often, and even if there are no photos of us together, from those days in the late 80s. So I think too about the idea of a story like this one that is set at a time when you were talking about the ATM machines. They were not ubiquitous. We didn't have those sorts of what we think. We don't even think of them as conveniences anymore. We just think of them as just a fact of our lives. So I feel like everything is relative. Were those days necessarily more difficult because we didn't have those conveniences, right? But at the same time, I feel like, well, it's also kind of perfect that the photos are so rare. That's also kind of perfect.
I always am marveling, since I live in a tourist town here in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, how people are always grabbing their phones when they see something memorable instead of putting them down and photographing them with your mind. There's just so many things that happen to us, and people are picking up their phones instead of experiencing and savoring the moment, which always to me is hilarious when there's certain things you can't photograph and that are so sacred that even if you photograph them, you will fail miserably in getting the power and sensation of the object that you're viewing. So sometimes, even though we have a phone, there's sometimes when you should put your phone down and really just take a picture with your heart and your mind and your presence. And I hope I did that with these characters. That I wrote about. I did have a couple of women friends when I was in Paris, but the story is really a composite of women I met in different countries, not just Paris. And they told me so many incredible stories. Some of them were older than me, some were younger. And a lot of the stories are in the book, of how they managed to get to Paris, the sleeping arrangements, the things that happened to them. Women tell each other their failures when they get very close, not just the great things, but I think maybe the mark of a friendship is that you can expose yourself at your most ridiculous and vulnerable. And I was always just heartbroken is the word, maybe, when I would hear these stories of these women, and it made me want to rescue them in some way. And I came home from this trip with so many people I met and so many stories, but nobody wanted to hear them. When you come back from a trip, it's like trying to share home movies. Nobody wants to see them, and everybody's too busy. So, they would ask, "How was your trip?" And I'd say, "Oh, let me tell you, that's good." And then I think, what do I do with all these stories? I don't have children. What do I do with these incredible things I witnessed, the things people told me? I'm still haunted by them all these years later. And so writing about it for me was a way to honor these women and their lives and their foibles and their survival skills, and also to record my own foibles, and to look at them from this perspective and say, all those mistakes, how important they were in my life. They brought me to who I am now.
Corina is a great reader. I love this about this character. Your reading life is so important to you too. I just read that piece in the New York Times about your reading life. It's just incredible. I was jotting down titles and names of authors, and I have heard you say, even in this conversation, that books are medicine.
Right, but unfortunately, sometimes we're forced to to take someone else's medicine, and it just makes us sick. We're required to take someone else's prescription. I'm always suspicious when anthologies say the 20 best American stories. So, your best, they're not mine. And, that's fine to take a look at someone else's prescription and see if there's something there that might nourish you, but it can also be very damaging. And I think we turn a lot of young people off to reading because they're not ready for the books we give them. We should give them a wider menu, that be more inclusive and more representational of all the genres and all the cultures of the world.
But it does go back to this idea that we each have to come to these things, or the books will come to us when they have to. I believe in that too.
Yes, but it's always good to have some guide there that puts them on a tray so we could select the one we want. Because if no one's offering them to us, as happens in Mexico, in the culture that I'm growing up into now, these years now that I see how young women and young people have no exposure to books.
Yeah.
And it's very sad. I pass young girls who the only thing they know how to do is to sell nopalitos and tortillas from a bucket. And they've never owned a book. They don't have books. And there isn't a culture, even with people who have money, of reading. There isn't that culture, especially not in the smaller towns and in the countryside. Forget about it. Books are very expensive. There are book programs for very select, small community of people in Mexico City, perhaps, or university students, but we don't have a way of introducing books to the community. Instead, the government gives away television sets, or television sets instead of books, which to me doesn't make any sense at all. So there isn't that investment in libraries or that access to free books that we take for granted in the United States.
Yeah, I think the access part is the most important, because then, as you say, people feel like they have a choice, like they will come to the things that they must read or want to read, and that goes too to this idea of access. I said in an interview with John Freeman that I had considered at one time that if I had read your books earlier in my life. I graduated from high school in 1984, which is when The House on Mango Street was first published. And I said to him, I think my life would have been very different if I had had access to that book at that time. And it's such an interesting idea to me, as you have done so much outreach with young people, visiting classrooms and talking to young people who can then turn around and see a woman of color who is an American writer, who has traveled the world, who lives in Mexico, and who writes these stories. And so that life becomes a place with more possibilities for somebody. And we don't limit ourselves just because we think we have to, or we think that that's going to be our story or our path. So I feel like that question of access is also related to representation and what is out there for us to be able to access to read.
And Yvette, you're making me think also, I'm having this conversation via email with a colleague of mine from Chicago poet, Carlos Compián, who and I go back all the way, from when I was 19 and met, and we've always been friends. And he was sending me book covers of writers who are invisible Chicana writers that nobody knows about, or invisible/Chicana Latina writers. And I was sending him some of mine, writers that I respect, who maybe only had one little chapbook and great writing, maybe some stronger than others, but all the same, they made the book. But where are they now? They were alongside me when I was coming up in the 70s and 80s. And it made me wonder, what are they doing now? And do they still write? And why can't we support those writers? Or let's write an article about these invisible women writers who wrote one chapbook, a lot of them through small presses that are defunct now, didn't have the distribution or power of a big New York publishing house. And maybe that's why, Macondo was created, my workshop. I just feel that there's a lot of good writers out there, but they need their connection with other writers to keep going, because in everyday life, you're so distracted by having to go buy kitty litter or make a meal. And it's so good to have other people that are your spiritual kin, know what it takes to get a manuscript done and who help you to get to the next point. So to me, that's what I always felt I needed, because my own family, they couldn't help me. They might have been happier if I hadn't taken this route. It has separated me from them. It has caused me to run away from Chicago and look for my home in South Texas and then further south in Mexico. Because as a writer, writing career is so anathema to what a perfect Mexican daughter, borrowing from Erica Sanchez, what a perfect Mexican daughter is supposed to be in a traditional family. And, I couldn't find those models in my family or my community, so I had to run away from home, make my own family. And that's what my writing workshop community did for me. I have those network of friends who understand, okay, I've got a new book. Look at every page and know that every page took at least a whole day of my life. So count how many pages there are and multiply it by the years. And you understand why I have been interned in this convent called writing.
How did the writing go in San Miguel de Allende through the pandemic that started in the spring of 2020?
Well, I'm a little ashamed to say that I flourished being home alone, because I'm called out to be a speaker so much. And I felt obliged to accept invitations during the last administration, maybe during every administration. And, speaking to me was a way of uplifting community in the same way that sermons uplift a community. So I felt my lectures were of a spiritual ministry. But being able to stay home with impunity allowed me to finish Martita. I just finished a book of poetry 2 weeks ago. That'll be out next fall. I've been working on the new translation with Fernanda Melchor of La Casa on Mango Street. And I've been working with Derek Baumel on the House on Mango Street, the opera. So I've been getting a lot of work done.
That's incredible. Well, you say something that reminds me of one more question about the Spanish, that this is a bilingual, this is a two-language book. Martita, te recuerdo. Why was it important for you to make sure to have this in Spanish?
I have to acknowledge Liliana Valenzuela, the poet and story writer that has worked with me and has been my friend for over 30 years. And she and I, have collaborated on many of my books, not all, but practically all. And she's a Texan, and she's a Tex-Mex Mexicana who went to Texas and migrated in the opposite direction than I did. As I told Liliana, it's so important for this to be in Spanish, because in real life, Martita was from Buenos Aires. So she was talking to me in Spanish. And the story was always Martita, te recuerdo. Since the beginning, it's always been in Spanish. Even the title, even though I wrote it, it was always Martita, te recuerdo. I could hear Martita speaking Spanish. And to have Liliana translated back into the way I heard her in my head seemed right. I was very lucky that my publishing house this time allowed the Spanish translation to be under one cover. You flip it over and it's in Spanish. And I was obliged, however, to change my title to an English title, but that wasn't an issue because I could just flip it over and there it is in the way I hear it in my mind.
Oh, it's so perfect. And I keep thinking about the way that Martita, being from Buenos Aires, she has this kind of worldliness there in Paris, but she's somebody that can be a sort of a go-between for Corina in a certain way that is so, for me, I think it's so Argentine. I don't know. It's just so kind of perfect. So I can imagine that would have been in your mind in Spanish. That's so lovely.
Well, I think, when you're traveling in a country where you don't speak the language, you try to find a community that speaks a common language. And that certainly was true for me when I was traveling. If I couldn't find people who spoke English, I felt maybe more at home when I found people who spoke Spanish, even if it wasn't the Spanish I grew up with. It was still a homecoming in a way. And that reminds me, I did the audiobook for the first time. I've recorded for the very first time in my life, I've recorded the Spanish version of my own story. I usually record all the English, but this is the first time I've done the English and the Spanish. So I hope people will take a listen. I'm so excited by the audio version. I did a lot of practicing, and I hope people will be inspired to maybe take Martita where I think she belongs, on the stage. Because after I performed it, I thought this is the right length for a performance. It's only 3 women characters and 1 male character that can play all the male parts. It's the right length for someone to sit and then get up and after having heard the whole thing. It's just the right size.
You know, in my own circle of friends who are big readers, there's such an energy right now about this book. We've got to read this book. This is a very different kind of Sandra Cisneros book. What is, for those who have not yet read it, how to explain this energy? I understand it, of course, but what do you think? What do you surmise when you hear somebody say that, oh my gosh, we're all so excited, we can't wait, we're all following you on Instagram, we can't wait one more second. What do you think it is?
What is different, you're asking, about this book?
Yeah.
Well, I think I really feel the writing is so much stronger because this is like a bottle of wine that I put in the cellar for so many years and then brought out and reworked and worked. And, it's a lot of rewriting, as you know, the task of writing, but I wrote it 30 years ago to bring it back out. And I feel I'm at the height of my literary powers here. So I could do something that I had done as a young girl, had to have the poetry and the succinctness of House on Mango Street. But when I experimented with a larger book in Caramelo, I could create these density of characters that I wasn't able to do when I was a young woman. And now, as I'm elder, I'm able to gather the succinctness of House with the density of Caramelo and create this small little story that's a whole universe. And that's what I feel I did. And I feel a great pride in how I was able to work this, and not by myself, of course. I had my friend Dennis Mathis and my editor Robin Desser helping me along, because by the end it's like a triathlon. You've got to have somebody there cheering you, throwing water on you and fanning you if you faint. So by the end you can't go on anymore, and you really do need your support team. But I tried to expand it and make it a full-length novel, because that's what publishing houses want. And, like all my work, this wanted to be what it wanted to be, and it evolved. And I don't know what to call it. People are calling it a novella. It's a long short story, which is kind of an oxymoron. I don't know what it is. It's between genres, again, like many of my works are. And I just know it wanted to be this length and not shorter, not longer. And I just think it's the right length to perform, to hear it out loud, to perform it. And my works are always meant to be read out loud. So do take a listen to the audio.
Well, it sounds like that process was total alchemy. Sandra Cisneros, thank you so much for talking to me today. Such a pleasure to get to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, lovely Yvette. I always enjoy things you have to say about literature and your profound questions that only another writer could ask. Mil gracias.
Sandra Cisneros is the author of Martita, I Remember You, Martita, Te Recuerdo. Liliana Valenzuela is the translator of this story in Spanish. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.